Have you had a desire created in you to do something about a problem somewhere? To attend to a need somewhere? To do something and contribute something solidly to a need or a problem existing somewhere? Have you had that divine surge in your heart where God really prompted you and caused you to pray and be burdened about something? That's a very good indication of what you're called to do in life.
The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning, new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness, O Lord. Great is thy faithfulness. They are new every morning, new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness, O Lord. Great is thy faithfulness. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning, new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness, O Lord. Great is thy faithfulness. They are new. They are new every morning, new. Great is thy faithfulness, O Lord. Great is thy faithfulness. They are new every morning, oh, new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness, O Lord. Great is thy faithfulness.
Genesis chapter 3, verse 14 and 15. So the Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, you are cursed more than all cattle, and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you shall go, and you shall eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Which tells us about the curse that came upon the serpent, because the devil used the serpent in the garden. There was no people in those days to use. Only Adam and Eve were there. If the people were there, the devil would have readily used them. Now he had to use a serpent. Now there are plenty of people, therefore the devil doesn't use serpents anymore. A lot of people themselves serve as devil's agents, So he's got a lot of help nowadays. So the Lord put a curse upon the serpent. On its belly it shall go and eat dust all the days of its life, and so on. But then the 15th verse is a very significant verse, loaded with meaning. And 15th verse says that I will put enmity between your seed and her seed, between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. There's a lot of things there in that verse. That's the first promise of the coming Messiah, that one day he's going to be born as the seed of the woman and crush the head of Satan. And that Satan is going to be able to bruise his heel as a result of what happens on the cross of Calvary and so on. All those things are embedded there in that verse. But there is also something else there, that the humanity is going to become two different streams. One is called the seed of the serpent, the devil, a generation of people that are used by the devil, governed by the devil, and then there is a generation of godly seed, people doing the will of God, and they will always be in enmity with one another. This enmity factor is a real problem in life, so that God's people, whatever they are trying to do, there is another power that is trying to frustrate God's purposes, trying to spoil, try to get in the way and hinder God's purposes. And this is a factor that makes work difficult. All those who are serving God, doing the will of God, and are very experienced in working for God and living for God, in whatever professions you are, as you live your life dedicated to God and work in this world, you found a lot of problems, a lot of difficulties come your way, especially targeting you, trying to hinder you, trying to stop you, trying to frustrate you. And that is the work of the enemy, the devil. You are on God's side working to fulfill God's purposes, and the devil is opposing that because he hates God's purposes and God's plans. Now, we used Joseph as an example to illustrate this truth, how in Joseph's life this enemy brought enemies to work against Joseph. But yet, even in the midst of that kind of a world and that kind of circumstance, Joseph rose to the highest positions in life, was used mightily by God to accomplish God's purposes. We saw that. The second example is the example of Daniel, who also lived in a foreign land under difficult circumstances, lived as a slave, just like Joseph in a foreign land as a slave, in a disadvantageous position, but yet God blessed the work of his hands and prospered him and gave him success and victory and great favor in that foreign land under difficult circumstances, and he rose to the highest levels of power in that Babylonian kingdom, and so on. Now today we're going to look at Nehemiah. I don't know how many of you have heard the story of Nehemiah and read the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is a wonderful story. In case you have not read it, sometimes you may have read it and you may not have made much of it. You may not have understood the story very well. It may have been confusing to you. So I'm going to give you a little background about Nehemiah, because Nehemiah is a wonderful story. 13 chapters. Out of that, we're going to look at only 6 chapters that matter in the first 6 chapters. But you can read the entire book. It's very useful. We're going to look at the first 6 chapters because we're going to concentrate on Nehemiah as a worker, as a man working in this world in a secular job, but he is literally a servant of God. He is a social and political reformer of society. And as such, he's not a preacher, you see. He's a social and political reformer of society, working for the government. Then he's sent as a governor to Jerusalem and so on. And he works as a social and political reformer, and how God is with him in that difficult job. Many lessons are there to be drawn from his life and this story as to how one must face adversity, circumstances, and difficult people, and work in the midst of it with God's favor on your side, and still expect victory, and still expect to overcome all the obstacles and win in your job. Nehemiah is a Jewish man who was born to the people that went as captives to Babylon. Remember, in 605 BC, starting from 605 BC, there was three times that Jerusalem was overtaken by the Babylonians, and captives were taken to Babylon 3 times. 3 batches of captives were taken. And Nehemiah's ancestors were people that went like that. And he was probably born in Babylon, raised up there. After 70 years of Babylonian captivity, they were set free by a Persian king who overtook Babylon and brought Babylon under his control. It became part of the Persian kingdom. And he released all the captives after 70 years. So after 70 years, people started coming back. In 3 groups they came back. One, they came back through with a man named Zerubbabel. If you read the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, you'll read that they came under Zerubbabel first, and then some came under Ezra, and the third group came under Nehemiah. Now, 70 years later, they were released. The first group went. So they went and settled down. The returnees, the people that returned from Babylonian captivity, began to work on rebuilding the temple and cleaning the place up and so on, because Jerusalem was destroyed literally by the captivity. And so they started working on it. When that generation passed away, there was a backslidden state among people. Once again, people forgot God. And Ezra came and brought about a great spiritual revival, great preaching, and emphasis on the Word of God and so on. But after that generation, people became backslidden, and there was a lot of social reform that was needed, a lot of injustice, a lot of unrighteousness in this community. They were oppressing themselves, their own people. They were slaves in a foreign land. The foreigners or the Gentiles, subjugated them and ruled over them. That was one thing. But these people started subjugating one another. They started making each other slaves, because of the debts owed by some poor people and so on. They were brought under their control and made to serve as slaves. And there was a lot of oppression in society, unrighteousness and injustice was going on. They needed a strong social reformer to come and set things right. Plus, 70 years later, they started going back. Now, 91 years later, the walls of Jerusalem were still in ruins. Now, walls were very important in those days. In a city, the wall is important because the wall, just looking at it, provides you safety. You know that when you get inside the walls, you're safe because that's your country, your city. There's protection there. Enemy cannot just barge in any time that he likes. So walls were important. Wherever a city loses its walls and walls are destroyed, immediately it will be rebuilt because it is very important. It gives sense of security to people. But even though the people have started returning now, and it's been 90 years since the first batch returned, in 90 years, they have not done anything about the walls. The walls were still in ruin. And the Gentiles that lived in Jerusalem at the time, because the Babylonians took the Jews as captives, a lot of them were gone. Others came and occupied the place. They were laughing at these people that returned. Said, look at what God has done for you. Look at your walls. 90 years have gone by. You have not even repaired your walls. You have not even rebuilt them. Look at the place and how it is and how unsafe it is and so on. They were laughing at them. And so there was a strong man needed to bring order in that place and social reforms in that place and rebuild the wall. And that is where Nehemiah comes in. Nehemiah was born to the people that went as captives in Babylon. And he was raised there and continues to live there. And just like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he has risen to high status in the government in the Persian kingdom, which was now ruling over Babylon. He was serving under the king as the cupbearer. Cupbearer is like a PA to the king. He's ever before the presence of the king. Now that's a very privileged position because the kings in those days, even his own wife has to seek permission to come and appear before him, to have an audience with him. And this man had the privilege of every day standing before the king, being near the king and serving the king. He's in a very advantageous position there. God has raised him up in that position and he is living there. His brother, who was in Jerusalem, brought news to him. This news comes 90 years after the first captives went back to Jerusalem. 90 years have gone by. His brother comes back from Jerusalem and Nehemiah inquires with eagerness about the city of his forefathers because they're all buried there. That's the native place, Jerusalem. Even though he is living under the Persian kingdom, he's always thinking about Jerusalem. He asks him, how's everything there? And the reply he got, it disturbed him very much. He was told that the city is in ruins. There's a lot of problems there, a lot of social problems there, a lot of difficulties there. And as he described the city, especially the walls broken down, and how the Gentiles are laughing at the God's people and so on, Nehemiah was moved in his heart, and he began to weep and fast and pray. Now the news comes to him in 446 BC, November, December, that time. And he's serving the king. 4 months he's praying and fasting and crying literally, asking for forgiveness before God for his people. That his people have forgotten God. That's why they're in this condition. The city of God is in that condition. He's repenting for the sake of the people, and he's calling upon God, reminding God, saying, Lord, you said if my people ever turn back to me and seek me, I will bless them again and bring them back from everywhere. Do that, O Lord. That was his prayer. In the first chapter, you read about it. His prayer and fasting. For 4 months period, he fasts and prays. Then 4 months later, in the month of March, 445 BC, he goes before the king. As usual, he's serving the king. He poured the wine before the king and gave it to him. And the king looked at him. Immediately, the king knew that this man was a sad man. Now, you better not be sad in the presence of the king in those days. The kings were in those days crackpots, just they could do anything. They can just cut your head off for being sad, Why are you not smiling, I'll cut your head off. That's the kind of people they were, And the king looks at him and says, hey, what happened? You look sad. You're not sick, are you? I know you're not sick. So it must be something in your mind, in your emotion. Something is happening. Tell me what's happening. So he told the story to the king about what was happening. Because he had prayed for 4 months and fasted for 4 months, now he was bold to tell the king what was in his mind. He said, I heard about the story in Jerusalem, how sad the place looked and how its walls are broken down and no one has attended to it in 90 years. Even though they've returned 90 years ago, they've done nothing of it. So he tells the king that he would like to go back and work on it. Now, in this 4 months period, as he prayed and fasted, one thing happened to Nehemiah. The call of his life became very clear to him. We're talking about work. So this aspect is very important for every person. What you're called for. Now we separate work as secular work and religious work and all that. In the Bible, there is no separation like that. This man is a political, social reformer. He was working for the king. He was working for the government. It doesn't say it's secular work and God doesn't get involved in it. No, God is very much involved in it. This man, after he heard it, he had such a burden for Jerusalem and started praying. Have you ever had any burden for anything? Have you started praying about it? Have you had a desire created in you to do something about a problem somewhere? To attend to a need somewhere? To do something and contribute something solidly to a need or a problem existing somewhere? Have you had that divine surge in your heart where God really prompted you and caused you to pray and be burdened about something? That's a very good indication of what you're called to do in life. Nehemiah all of a sudden feels this thing and he's crying and praying and fasting, pleading before God. And in the 4 months period, he has now become very clear about the call of his life. One thing that happens is he's very clear about the call of his life. And another thing is he makes preparations to go back. He's still serving the king, but he has not asked the king to let him go. But in his mind, he's very clear. Through the prayer and fasting, he has reached the conclusion that God wants him back there in Jerusalem to do something about that problem, to contribute something very valid to that situation. And now when the king asks, he opens his mouth. And the way the Bible puts it is amazing. In chapter 2, it says, then the king said to me, what do you request? The king, after he told him that Jerusalem is in this condition, that's why I'm sad. The king says, what do you request? What do you want? So I prayed to the God of heaven. While talking to the king, he is praying inside, inwardly. While talking to the king, he is in a prayer mode, literally. He is making his petition to God, say, God, help me. Help me to say the right words here. Help me to speak up. And then he says to the king in verse 5, if it pleases the king and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. Now, It sounds very ordinary that he just stands before the king and says, let me go back, I want some leave to go and attend to this. You cannot talk to the king like that in those days, You can't just be going and applying for leave like that. Like I said, they can cut your head off for anything, To have the boldness to say, King, I want to go for an extended period of time and spend my time there. I feel like this is the mission of my life. I got to do it. God has called me to do it. It's something. It's to a strange foreign king who does not understand this God and know this God, does not really worship this God. To say this is something extraordinary. But his prayer and fasting has brought into him such boldness and confidence. He was able to look at the king and say to him, look, I want to go back, and if you will permit me, I will go back, and I would like to attend to this thing if I have favor in your sight, if I could do that, he says. Now, so he became very clear about his call. We must become very clear about our call in life. That's one thing that is very important. I remember as a 20-year-old boy, I went to study in Bible college. I was literally scared, I had not gone out of my home. They did. My father one time decided to put me in a hostel in Tuticorin, because I was running around playing music here. He thought I won't study well. If I be here, I'll be doing only music. So he took me and put me in a hostel there in Tuticorin, and I studied there one day. I left my trunk and everything and ran away here. A telegram came. By the time I arrived, the telegram also arrived saying absconded, So at 20 years of age, one guy who was visiting here from America, he was eating with my father in a restaurant, and I was also eating with them. Those days, I used to just drive the car for my father. I like driving, That was the age when I started driving. And I was just sitting and eating. They were busily talking about everything. And that guy all of a sudden turned to me and said, would you like to go to a Bible college in America? I didn't know what to say. I was busy eating my chapati and chops, So I just shook my head, I didn't know what this guy is asking, what he meant, I didn't know he was going to make arrangements. So he went back. In 2 months, I received a letter from the president of the college saying, so-and-so recommended you. You please fill out this application. We're going to take you. So that's how I went. And when I went, my father told me, don't run back, Stay there. Do something useful. So I went over there. And believe me, in those days, the laws were so strict, I had to carry only $8. Only $8 were allowed. You cannot carry any money even if you had some money. So I had $8 in my pocket. I wouldn't even drink a cup of coffee. I quit drinking. Every day in my house, they gave me coffee in the morning and evening. This was a habit. I couldn't live without coffee in the morning. After going there, I forgot coffee. Because you have to put 10 cents and buy coffee there. So in the dormitory. So I didn't want to do that because I'll be 10 cents less, I had only $8 and I had to wash my clothes and I had ended up without any money. And I didn't know God this close, and I didn't know the calling of my life, and I never, related to God that closely in those days, Never really trusted God for anything. So I became very worried about what I was going to do. And I realized that some students are praying in the chapel, in the big chapel at night time in the dark. I thought nobody was there, but there was guys praying there, sitting in the dark. So I started making it a habit going there, sitting in the dark and praying. And I used to talk to God and tell my problems and say, God, you have to meet my needs. And God did some amazing, wonderful things in my life.
Let's put our hands together. These are some awesome days that we live in, right? These are the days of Elijah, declaring the word of the Lord. These are the days of the servant Moses, righteousness being restored. And these are days of great trials, famine and darkness and sword. Still a voice in the desert crying, prepare ye the way of the Lord. Behold, he comes, riding on clouds, shining like sun. At the trumpet call, so lift your voice. It's a year of jubilee, and out of Zion's hill salvation comes. These are the days of Ezekiel, dry bones becoming his flesh. These are the days of your servant David, rebuilding the temple of prayer. These are the days of the harvest, the fields are as white in the world. We are the laborers in your vineyard, declaring the word of the Lord. Behold, he comes, riding on the clouds, shining like the sun. At the trumpet call, so lift your voice. It's the year of jubilee, and out of Zion's hill salvation. Behold, behold, he comes, riding on the clouds, shining like the sun. At the trumpet call, so lift your voice. It's the year of jubilee, and out of Zion's hill salvation comes. There's no God like our God. See it. There's no God like Jehovah. 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 Behold, he comes, riding on the clouds, shining like the sun. At the trumpet call, so lift your voice. It's a year of jubilee, and out of Zion's hill salvation. Behold, he comes, riding on the clouds, shining like the sun. At the trumpet call, so lift your voice. It's a year of jubilee, and out of Zion's hill salvation.